patients. So I'm delighted that, to present Sarah to the stage, who will be talking to us about rethinking rehabilitation.
Which one? Thank you, Beth, and thank you for inviting me. Today I thought I'd share the journey that I've had, probably coming up to 5 years, maybe 6 years in the making, about my approach to rehabilitation, what has led to maybe the change of thoughts and the impact that that's had for our patients. So I'll start you back on my journey. I've been working in neuro rehab now for over 20 years, and probably back into about 2016, I'd had an interest in rehabilitation technologies and where they sit within the field of rehabilitation, how they improve patient outcomes or whether they improve patient outcomes. But because of that position, I was being approached across the industry to buy technology, and there's a lot of it around and it's very expensive. So people were saying, buy this, buy that, put it in, and some of it might be £5,000, some of it might be 20, some of it's 60. Some of it's the cost of a Ferrari, and it's trying to decide how you buy this equipment and whether it's going to have a return on investment as a businesswoman, but also a clinical return on investment. So it got me thinking about what we do and whether the model of therapy is actually worthwhile. So I started to have a look at the clinical evidence about intensity and rehabilitation. I went and had a look at some colleagues that were working down in London, and some of you might be aware of Nick Ward and his team who are doing intensive rehab for upper limb therapy at Queen's Square. And then according to my husband, I had a couple of jollies to Europe, but I travelled around clinics in Slovenia, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Croatia, because actually they're far more advanced in using technology for rehabilitation, and came back and decided I would reinvent how we do our therapy. So what was the rationale behind that? Well, following on from Ruth's talk this morning, we know that there are national guidelines that essentially the more you do, the better you get. The intensity of rehabilitation is going to impact on the outcomes of our patients. And talking to the audience, you should all be aware of probably the principles of neuroplasticity. That is the rewiring of our nervous system. It's how we learn, it's how we grow. And for me, the problem was that we know the more you do, the better you get. You don't send your children to school for 1 hour a week. If I want to be an Olympic athlete, I don't turn up, do 5 repetitions of throwing a javelin and go, well, that's me done for the day. But why are we delivering rehabilitation like that? Why do we do 1 hour a week of therapy? It didn't make any sense. And our national guidelines support this idea. So these are the therapy guidelines for stroke. And it says higher intensity of rehabilitation can improve the quality of life for those who've had the stroke. And improvements that the adults should expect will be dependent on their health, their pre-morbid situation, their abilities before the stroke, but crucially, the intensity of their rehabilitation. Our guidelines would suggest that we should be delivering 45 minutes a day, and this is based predominantly on stroke. We sit well behind the rest of the world. Canada, Australia are recommending 3 hours of therapy a day. So this is what we're advocating. But what's the reality? Now, a colleague of mine, Sarah Tyson, did a paper that was published in 2018 to look at rehabilitation. And this is based on strokes. There's a lot more evidence for strokes than there are for traumatic brain injuries. And she went to about 22 stroke units across the UK to have a look at therapy provision. And quite frankly, it's a little bit depressing. So the average number of sit-to-stands that a patient will do in a therapy session on a stroke unit is 5. I'll go back to that athlete training for the Olympics. They don't throw the javelin 5 times and go, that's me done for the day. The average time that the patient's standing upright is just over 11 minutes. And the number of steps that they can do in a therapy session is around 200. And crucially, to achieve that, you're using very heavy human resources. It's 2.1 members of qualified staff to achieve what is very little dosage and very little intensity. So when you start to think about the outcomes of our patients, it becomes quite concerning that we know this doesn't look enough at all. So that was the basis of me redesigning how we deliver our therapy. And I think very much there's a role that technology can play. So why did we need a new concept? Well, first thing is we've got a growing population of individuals with disability. And actually, my colleagues that have spoken this morning, Dr. Theo this morning, the presentation we've just had, will show you that the developments in modern medicine are phenomenal. Patients that were injured 20 years ago when I qualified would not survive, are now surviving today with significant amount of disability. We also know, very sadly, that our public services are under significant pressure. It's very difficult. Our hospitals are bursting at the seams. Again, the conversation this morning was that hospitals was like a war zone trying to get into an A&E department. And that's unfortunately only going to get worse and has been compounded significantly by the pandemic. And what we know about rehabilitation is it's a very long process, it's human resource heavy, and it's not a criticism of staff and my colleagues in the NHS, but it is a criticism of funding and resources that are available. And this leads to the fact that inpatient therapy is time limited. Patients are discharged back into the community. Ruth mentioned that earlier, that we know that the intensity of inpatient therapy is excellent. The intensity for outpatient or community-based services don't exist. And I did this presentation a little while back, a number of years ago, and said we have these guidelines for inpatient rehabilitation, but we don't have any same guidelines for community or outpatient rehabilitation. And a gentleman in the front put his hand up and he said, "I think you'll find they do." And I went, "Oh, I'm not really sure they do." And he said, "I think you'll find I wrote them." And I had a slight panic. And he's a gentleman I work with quite a lot these days, and it was Professor Rory O'Connor from here in Leeds. And I said, "Well, okay, that's really interesting. What are the guidelines then?" And he said, "Well, everyone should have as much therapy as they need." I said, "Well, I think that's an aspiration rather than a guideline, unfortunately." So we do laugh about it still to this day. So I kind of felt that our therapy provision is inadequate, and we needed to think about how we do this differently. And as I said, there is consistent evidence and very strong evidence that higher intensity therapy will end up with better outcomes. And my opinion was, when I was looking at the technologies, that there are real benefits to incorporating technology. And Ruth hit the nail on the head this morning. Technology is very expensive, but it essentially does the square root of nothing in a therapy centre unless you know how to use it. It is there to augment treatment, it's not there to replace it. So we have to use this, and if it's not used, it gets a bad reputation. And I'll give the example. There's a hospital in the UK that has invested in a robotic gait trainer for walking, £250,000 investment, fantastic piece of equipment. The person that was championing the purchase of that piece of equipment got it in, it was used, but that member of staff moves on, the staffing changes, they hadn't serviced the device, people forget, they look and think, "Oh, do I know how to switch it on? How does it work?" And invariably, it sits as a white elephant in the corner. And for me, the technology then gets a bad reputation. That's expensive, white elephant doesn't help. It's not the technology's fault, it's how you implement it. And I would argue buying technology and dropping it into an existing service and expecting that it will be incorporated will never ever work. You have to redesign how you deliver your rehabilitation to maximise the outcomes of the technology. And ultimately, there has to be a return on investment. And for the lawyers in the room, that's the same when you're looking at your schedule of loss and you're looking at costing your claims. This is not a shopping list that you then go, "Oh, do you know what, we'll just put this, this, this and this because the patient's had a brain injury or a spinal cord injury." It's about how you integrate it, because the return on investment is not necessarily financial. It's about the clinical outcomes and how that's going to impact on everybody's life. So for me, I didn't want to be having a department where we had technology for people to come and try and buy it. It was using technology to enhance the rehabilitation outcomes. Hang on. Yep. We opened the first centre in Leeds, here in Leeds, in 2018. I say the royal we, but it's me and a fantastic team of therapists and my supporting team there. And we invite patients to come and join us for intensive programs of rehabilitation. It's all based on evidence-based and across the literature. We started off where we take UK-wide referrals. Increasingly, and not really intended, we now have a large cohort of overseas patients. So we have patients travelling from the US, Canada, Australia, Nigeria, France, Spain, Italy, Pakistan, India. And they attend, and we have a pre-assessment to see whether they're suitable to attend the rehabilitation programme. That's usually done by a therapist. And we identify their goals for therapy and what they're going to achieve. And we do baseline assessments as they attend. And then the patients attend for 4 hours of therapy every single day. 1 hour is traditional hands-on, conventional physiotherapy and occupational therapy. We are a predominantly physical rehab service. The remaining 3 hours in the day are still on a one-to-one basis with clinicians, but they then attend using the robotics, VR technology, gamification, sensor-based technology. And the idea is that we're doing high repetitions. Now, it's really important to say we're not replacing therapists or clinicians with robots and VR. What we're doing is we're facilitating an environment where patients can do high repetitions in the right movement patterns to achieve the right goals. And that's the crucial part. Perfect practice makes perfect. But what we allow with the technology is that it provides us high repetition training with biofeedback. That's information external to the patient that validates their performance, that tells them whether they're doing something right and whether they're doing something wrong. And it provides them with an opportunity to see their performance and then work towards improving it. But we can still put our hands on and do all the touchy-feely things that as therapists like to do. The total package of care is for 80 hours, but it's tailored to the individual needs of the patient. All the usual clinical processes that you would have in place remain the same. It's assessment-based, it's goal-driven, it's monitored as we go along. We might change the choice of the robotics, we might change the choice of the VR technology that we're using during the programme as they're monitored week by week. I've put up on there as fatigue, because I think probably a lot of people think the idea that someone's doing 4 hours of therapy 5 days a week sounds almost horrifying for somebody with a brain injury, because people do get very upset and very worried about fatigue. So the first thing I would say is that for many of our patients who've had a brain injury, it's a one-off traumatic event. And when my medical colleagues and the colleagues in the NHS and are in the acute sector have stabilised them, the majority of our patients are not unwell, they just need rehabilitation, is the first point. The second, I think we're under-ambitious for our patients. We have probably too low expectations of what they can achieve. For many of my clients, it will take them an hour to get washed and dressed in the morning. If I'm only ever rehabbing them for 1 hour a day, or 1 hour a week, how am I equipping them and giving them skills to return back to everyday life? You're never giving them the exercise tolerance, the endurance, the abilities to do exercises over and above their daily life. But having said all of that, we really respect fatigue, and within our clinic we have a mindset of identifying the difference between tiredness and fatigue. I have absolutely no problems of making somebody tired. They can rest when they get home. No problems. Fatigue is something that needs to be respected. And our differential is fatigue is when the quality of someone's performance starts to deteriorate. But I would argue that's not a reason to stop rehabilitation. It's an argument to change the task. So if they're fatiguing with upper limb activities, you do lower limb. If they're fatiguing with physical activities, you do more cognitive-based, and you change it around. It's not a reason that they should be in therapy sitting, and as you saw on the really early slide, 5 repetitions of one exercise is not rehabilitation. So we're very respectful of it, and we'll tailor to our patients, but I think we underestimate what people are capable of achieving. We do provide patients with their lunches, and we've also thought really hard to accommodate carers and family members when they attend the clinics. The idea was that we would be in an environment where they could go off and have some respite and maybe go shopping, use local facilities, go into the countryside. invariably what happens, they don't leave. They stay with us in the clinic and we provide them with tea and coffees, but I think it's just a very engaging environment for them to be in. So I'll leave that video running in the background. The clinic can accommodate, and the technology will accommodate adults and children, and actually we do have the two working. This is the clinic, the video showing the clinic being built in December 2020 over in Hull. So we do take adults and paediatrics, and we'll see a range of conditions. So we're predominantly neurological rehabilitation, so we do strokes, acquired and traumatic brain injuries, cerebral palsy, Parkinson's, spinal cord injuries, transverse myelitis, MS. Not everybody is right for intensive rehabilitation. That's based on their assessment. I've got FMD there, functional movement disorder or functional neurological disorder. For the clinicians in the room, I've seen this condition skyrocket in the last 5 years. It's quite terrifying, and it's usually young adults, so adolescents, teenagers into their early 20s. It seems to be, well, I think probably another growing pandemic of people having difficulties with very physical or cognitive challenging, but with no organic basis. And I'm not quite sure where that's going to go and how that's going to hit our services, but they do extremely well. I've also identified just 2 conditions. The complex polytrauma orthopedic patients do exceptionally well. And I've also got kind of pain highlighted. It's not an area of interest for me, but I think it's a really interesting area of incorporating robotics and VR technology for the chronic pain patients, in that they are engaged, they get biofeedback, it's externally validating their abilities and their function rather than focusing on their experience of pain. And this idea of repetitive training with positive biofeedback rather than that pain focus, I think has a real interesting area for development in the field of rehabilitation. What's really important for us is about setup time. The choices of the devices and those little jollies to different clinics was to have a look at technology that is clinically useful, and there's many devices around, and the global market for technologies is starting to soar, but it has to be clinically useful. So if it takes you 45 minutes to set somebody up into a robotic device, then that's very much wasted therapy time. You've got no clinical return on your investment. So the setup has to be useful, but it also has to provide useful activities. So there's some devices that are very unilateral, or they do very limited movement patterns, or you have very limited scopes with their patients to be able to do a range of activities. I think there was a question earlier about VR technology. The difference between the technologies that we're using in clinic to maybe commercially available devices is that all of the equipment can be calibrated to the individual patient's need or ability or function. So if somebody wants to play tennis on a Nintendo Wii, you have to do large-scale movements. If someone wants to play a very similar kind of gamification device and all they can do is shrug their shoulder, that's the control mechanism. That's the real difference between a medical robotic or gamification device versus the commercially available ones. As I said, I've been doing this now for 5 years, and I'm still overwhelmed by how powerful biofeedback is. So the robotic devices and the VR devices that we have provide visual feedback for the patient. It provides auditory feedback for the patient, and some of them provide haptic feedback, say sensory feedback. So they're constantly getting feedback on their movement patterns or what it is that they've achieved. That seems to be a very powerful motivator. Maybe it's a research area for the future. We can do a whole range of assessments for our patients, which again is very useful. The technology can do validated assessments of spasticity, range of movement, power, strength, control, coordination. So it's essentially putting maybe some of the clinical assessments we've done traditionally as therapists into a device that eliminates that inter-rater reliability issues. So if you've got one clinician measuring and they come back the next week and a different clinician does the measurements, we lose all of that variability. So the outcome measures are much more specific. As a clinic, we mentioned the reference centre research status. We're collecting huge amounts of data, and I'm frequently asked, are we doing research within the clinic? we're not a research institute. We are putting clinical research into practice. And the research evidence is already there to support robotic and VR devices, technology, with traditional therapy. So there's high-level evidence to support that you have to combine traditional approaches with the tech, not replace it. So I'm starting to implement rehabilitation technologies based on research evidence. And there's a rather depressing paper that was published, I think, about 2007 by a chap called Cohen, who said the time lag from clinical research to change in clinical practice is on average 17 years, which is quite, sorry, I didn't mean to depress you in the front. You've got nodding from her to the front.
I thought that was quite quick.
You thought that was... I thought it was quite depressing. So for me, but having said that, our data collection is huge. So we have been involved in a project with Leeds University, with the Zurich University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland, and if anybody has any burning desire to have a data dump and to do some research, we'll quite happily provide you with our data with all the necessary consents. And overwhelmingly, the patients are really engaged. I think it's very challenging for patients to engage in the amount of rehabilitation that they need. I've been a physiotherapist for a long time, but quite frankly, what we do can be really boring. So you do... It can be. You do all this beautiful movement analysis, you identify where all their problems are, and at the end of the day, the exercise is put your foot up on a block, take your foot off the block, put your foot up on a block, take your foot down off the block. And how long can you do that? And if I hear a physiotherapist say, give me a high five, that becomes really dull for the patients. And we know that neuroplasticity and rewiring of our nervous system is stimulated when you're engaged. And a lot of traditional therapy is not terribly engaging. So what have we seen the impact on our therapy? So firstly, the obvious is that we can increase the intensity of our therapy. We can increase the dosage. So in that earlier slide, you'll see that the average number of steps that a patient did in a therapy session was 200 steps, 202, I think it is. When we had a look at our robotic gait trainer, the average number of steps that patients are taking about 2,500 to 3,000 steps. It's massive. The other thing that I would say with that is that for us to use this technology, the impact on human resources is significant as well. So instead of that 2.1 qualified therapists, we can be putting someone into a robotic gait trainer with one therapist, body weight support. My husband calls it a treadmill, and I get very upset about him calling it a treadmill type device, because this was the one that cost the price of the Ferrari. It has robotics and a foot plate, and they take you through a natural walking pattern. You can have body weight support, so someone can do thousands of repetitions of steps versus a couple of hundred, and we can do that with one clinician rather than 2 or 3. And for the therapists in the room, how many of us have skirted around on a skateboard, wheelie stool, crawled along the floor, trying to pick up someone's feet? You get repetition in good movement patterns. We can really precisely control the assistance of movements or the reliability of movement patterns. So repetition in a way that we really haven't been able to do at all. And it's very repeatable even between staff. As I said, we've got quantifiable and objective measures of the subject's performance. We know what's happening. And it's been extremely motivating for the patients with biofeedback. That reduced physical assistance and demand on human resources, I think, is a really interesting point. For us, it's allowed us to analyse our skill mix within the team. So because some of this technology is so good, it doesn't necessarily need a qualified therapist to be delivering the treatment. All of the programs are overseen, but you can downgrade and use maybe therapy assistants or rehabilitation support workers. So when we're looking at the challenge and demand within the health service, recruitment is very challenging, waiting lists are very high, patients need to have therapy. Yes, there is a large capital outlay to invest in this technology, but the return on investment, I think, is very important. And for me, when I did this project, I had a moment of thinking, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. If I don't do it, someone else will, and if someone else can do it, why can't I? So I did take the crazy step of remortgaging my house to invest in the clinic and do it. It was a little bit hairy going through COVID, I'll admit. And then I did have a crazy moment after COVID. We were so busy and the demand for our services had been so high that I went back to the bank, borrowed even more money and opened the second clinic. But I wouldn't have done it if there wasn't a financial return on investment. So I would advocate, particularly into my NHS colleagues, it's definitely a way to go. There's a clinical outcome and return on investment for the patients, and there is a financial business model that does make sense. So what do I think about the future of rehabilitation? I personally feel very passionate about the use of technology, not about replacing therapists, not about having a room full of machines where you line them up, you press go, and then when they're finished, you start back. But it actually can offer real benefits for our patients, and it shouldn't be a shopping list. It's about accelerating patients' outcomes. We're not necessarily fixing our patients that come in for a package of care. What we're doing is giving them a burst of essentially 2 years of worth of therapy in 4 weeks. We're accelerating what they can achieve. When they come to us from other parts of the UK or from overseas, they come to us for a burst of therapy, and then we send them back to their other therapy providers. We liaise and work really closely. Increasingly since COVID, we're now supporting the NHS and taking NHS referrals, and it's all about maximising the outcomes. Because we're accelerating somebody's rehabilitation, we're accelerating their outcomes and improving their function. What we have seen is a significant drop in the readmission rates. So within the Yorkshire region, I think the readmission rate following discharge from stroke within 30 days is at about 37%. Of that, 23% of the readmissions is related to falls or musculoskeletal injuries. So the impact of that readmission is significant, has a big financial impact. But on the individual, just think about the secondary complications that has. We're reducing morbidity for patients and secondary health complications. We're getting them fitter, we're getting them more active. Patients can do more for themselves. Rehabilitation for our clients shouldn't be 1 hour a week for as long into the future. If that's what it looks like as a therapist, I'm not doing my job correctly. Somebody shouldn't be reliant on physiotherapy forever and ever and ever. What we're trying to do is give them the skills and equip them to be as independent and, as Reece said earlier today, as autonomous as possible. And what we find is because we can get somebody better quicker, we allow them to get back to their normal day and everyday life a lot better. We're seeing improved functions for our patients that then has a knock-on effect on gratuitous care and also formal care. So the impact, I think as Reece said earlier, if you can reduce a care package from 2 carers to 1 carer or to someone being independent, the financial impact on that individual is significant, but also the patient's sense of worth and well-being if they're more autonomous. And we've also got patients getting back into work. The non-financial benefits for our patients is definitely improved quality of life. They can do more for themselves, and because they're more independent. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to show you a little bit of a video about the clinic as a whole and then share a couple of case studies with you.
That we can for her to bring her the best outcome.
I think we just want to try and do as much as we can for her, and having an opportunity for her to experience it is just fantastic.
The equipment is going to suit different people, and it's the repetitive movements which re-educates the brain and causes that neuropathway to regrow. And under a normal circumstance, we walk up and down wall bars maybe 20 times in a session, but here, when we were on the Lexo machine, Rolly did 200 steps and he wasn't on it that long. Well, that of course is going to speed up processes, and I think that, you know, we would not be anywhere near as able as we would if we hadn't been carrying on coming here. But here, when we were on the Lexo machine, Rolly did 200 steps and he wasn't on it that long.
I could tell when the machine started moving the fingers, I thought, Jill hasn't seen the fingers do this for 3 years.
here.
I thought,
Able.
I'm a little bit emotional, so I know Joe must be.
Yeah.
You know, actually watching the fingers move as they should do.
Honestly, I was doing my fingers.
You know, I could tell when the
I
machine
think-
was moving the fingers. Jill hasn't seen the fingers
mental
do this
as
for
well
3
as
years.
physical, and
I'm
they
a little
have
bit
a
emotional,
machine
so I know
that's
Jill must be.
Yeah.
You know,
applicable
actually
to
watching the
your
fingers move
injury.
as they should do.
Honestly, I was doing my fingers.
Possibilities are endless, really, with it,
think-
and the repetition of all the devices and
mental
all
as
the
well
different games that she
as
can play, and it's just
physical.
doing so much good
They
for her.
have a
So you know she can have fun
machine
as well as get a good physio session as well.
applicable
If she's
to
got
your
something in front of her, a game or anything like that, and she's working her legs at the same
Possibilities
time,
are
it's
endless,
just
really, with it.
giving
The
her that
repetition
extra
of all
benefit,
the
really,
devices
and
and
it's
all
come
the
somewhere
different
like
games
this is
that
just
she's playing.
great.
It's just doing so much good for her, so you know she can
For
have
somebody
fun
who's
as well as
got
get a
Jill's
good
condition,
physio
she
session as
needs to be able to work every part of the body that's been affected by a stroke.
I need it 100%. I do. My leg and my arm, I want it all. Yeah.
I think from a cognitive point of view as well, as a physio, you know, point of view there from her movement, it just works on both elements, and having access to that is so key really for overall development.
The machine which exercises the hand, I'm extremely pleased with that he's used today, because it's just showing that he's actually got 14% coming through in that hand now, which was dead a year ago. So I think these machines have show great potential. Would you say? Would you say so? I'm extremely pleased that he's used today, because it's just showing that he's actually got 14%
So I'd
coming
like to
through
share
in
a
that hand
presentation,
now,
a
which
case
was
study
dead a
of,
year ago.
Marlon.
So I think these
some
machines
people who might have seen me speak of
show great potential. Would
seeing
you
talk
say? Would you say so?
So when Marlon came to us, he'd been in a rehab unit locally and had been discharged, unfortunately, from his rehab unit with the title unrehabable. He was being peg-fed, he was doubly incontinent, and he was wheelchair bound. His mum was a big advocate of rehabilitation and just wanted to know what was possible. And when I first met Marlon, I remember doing the assessment, and as Reed said, we don't just put our finger in the air. I said, I think we might get you standing, but I'm not going to promise. His mum was a big advocate of rehabilitation. So Marlon came in and joined us for intensive rehab. And when I first actually did, in total, he did 4 intensive packages back to back. So we're not necessarily fixing on the first package, and it incorporated hands-on therapy, using the robotics, using VR, using gamification. I love Marlon. He actually did, in total, he did 4 intensive packages back to back. So we're not necessarily fixing on the first package. It's a very emotional day. Everyone cried that day. Using the robotics, using VR, using gamification. I love Marlon. It's a very emotional day. Everyone cried. So when we're talking about quality of life, from being unrehabable and discharged to a nursing home, Marlon lives on his own with no care, fully independent. And I really need to update the video because he started bodybuilding. And so when we're talking about he sent me, we're friends on Facebook, and he sent me a video of him in a bodybuilding competition this summer, which he won his category in an able-bodied category. Now, you wouldn't recognise him because he's fantastic. Smothered in olive oil and absolutely shredded. And he's a good-looking lad. But me being the nerdy physio was absolutely fascinated because I don't know if anyone's seen a bodybuilding competition. They hold various poses. and one of them was down on the knees and where's the beach kind of pose. And he had managed to transition through these poses, get down onto one knee, get back up again. And I was definitely more interested in that than the skimpy Speedos and the shiny orange body. Right, I've got one more case study, and again, this is just an example of function, really. Nicola was in the interview. Nicola was interviewed in one of the earlier videos. Skimpy Speedos and the shiny orange body, and she'd had I've got one more case study. Bleed, I think. Again, this is just an example of function, really. Nicola was in the interview. So you'll see hanging off her waistline is some electrotherapy. We use FES, we use electrical stimulation. So she has something there, but she couldn't use this functionally. So you'll see hanging off her waistline is some electrotherapy. We use FES, we use electrical stimulation. So she has something there, but she couldn't use this functionally. The device that she's on at the minute is called an Amadeo. It's made by a company called Tara Motion based in Austria. And having said robots don't replace therapists, this is the one device that probably does, because it allows consistent opening and closing of the hand at the same speed, at the same velocity, at the same pressures, same range, and huge repetitions. As a therapist, I can't open and close someone's hand that many times. So she did that incorporated with other VR technologies, where she sees an avatar of her hand. And this was her after just one package of care, 80 hours of therapy. Same pressures, same range, and huge repetitions. As a therapist, I can't open and close someone's hand that many times. And she sent us these afterwards when she got home. And I like to say, as a physio, my trousers are a shade of green, because I'm very much bordering onto the world of OT, because this is what it's all about. So I think sometimes the OTs get the more job satisfaction because they get to see people put it into daily life. Go back to what Ruth was saying earlier. Physios work very much the impairment, range of movement, strength, spasticity. It means absolutely nothing if they can't do day-to-day tasks. Because this is what it's all about. So I think sometimes the OTs get the more job satisfaction. So her husband was absolutely thrilled. Nicola not so much. She's back doing the jobs in the kitchen. Range of movement, strength, spasticity. It means absolutely nothing if they can't do day-to-day tasks. So her husband was absolutely thrilled. Nicola not so much. She's back doing the jobs in the kitchen. So I wanted to share my journey because my clinical practice has really changed. So I think there is a real role for technologies. It can't be a shopping list. You have to think about what it is and how you're going to use it and how it's going to benefit the patient. And I actually think that we also need to be more ambitious for our patients. And we need to think about how we deliver rehabilitation packages. Because if I look at these, particularly two individuals, but many of our clients, I don't believe Marlon, within the space of 9-10 months, whatever it was, would be back living independently with no care package if he'd come for physio 1 hour a week. So I think it's what I wanted to share with you is maybe rethink what your perceptions of rehabilitation, rethink what it looks like, and we can be more ambitious and have better outcomes for our patients and our clients. Thank you for indulging me and listening.